born in factories, delivered by engineers, immune to the bullets of the regular soldier, unbothered by the burdens of the land. The tank, the future of warfare. And while 100 years ago they might have been the future of warfare, these days they serve as introductory pieces to the Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset. You also have the opportunity to climb in some of these First World War relics. The one shown here is the Mark IX tank, which wasn't a tank per se, it actually became the world's first armored personnel carrier. As you can imagine, the conditions for crewing such a thing were appalling. Cramped, poorly ventilated, some crews even knocked themselves out if they fell too hard in a ditch because the tank had no suspension. Nevertheless, they proved successful on the battlefield, spurring a change from the cavalry corps to the tank corps. Development of the tank continued. During the interwar period, most major nations had a tank similar to this one, the A1E1 Independent. Heavily armed, armored, now with a suspension capable to do cross-country, they thought that they will be effectively land ships. But during the Second World War, in a time period as little as 6 years, infantry tanks as this Matilda here will evolve into something bigger, better than any interwar period tank could ever be. And going through the museum, you get an understanding of how the standard template for a tank was formed. It was a triangle between firepower, armor, and mobility, and adjusting those angles gave you a different kind of tank. Seeing that we are in Great Britain, we're going to talk about the British standard tank doctrine they had back then. First up, they had a class called the infantry tanks, like this Valentine, or this Churchill. Heavily armed and armored, they're offset by their low mobility, but that was by design, because they were made to keep up with infantry advances. Then you had the cruiser tanks, which had great mobility and firepower, but it came at the cost of their armor. They operated mostly as scouts, but also as gap exploiters whenever one was found in the enemy line. There were also specialist tanks developed, like the Churchill Avery, which had a spigot mortar installed to lob high explosive shells at enemy fortifications. Or the Tetrarch, light enough to be carried by a glider, useless in 1944 combat conditions. The Americans, on the other hand, focused themselves with mass-producing jack-of-all-trade type of tanks. First off was the M3, followed by the M4 Sherman. This one here is actually the second Sherman to roll off the assembly line, a rarity in itself. And what a striking balance they achieved with this tank. It had sufficient level of protection, sufficient level of armament, and sufficient mobility. And all of its shortcomings don't matter when you can muster up a force of thousands of Shermans in an attack. And it was also very flexible. You could stick a bigger gun on it, you could put a flamethrower, a mine flail, a crane to recover vehicles. If you think about something, chances are it was already put on a Sherman. The Soviets followed the same mass production approach, with the T-34 being a notable example of it. As for the Germans, cue the montage. As you can see, the Germans decided to go big or go home, and nothing screams giant more than the Jagd Tiger. And while this behemoth will never be able to move again, its little brother can. This is the Tiger 131. Oh yeah, this is a fully functioning Tiger tank, the same one they used in the Fury movie. How cool is that? Captured in North Africa after a lucky shot from a Churchill, it was brought back to Britain for testing, where they realized a major folly in German tank design. They were resource-hungry, unreliable, and not mass-producible. Sure, they looked imposing, but that came at the cost of complexity. Yes, you had the Panzer III, Fords, and to some extent the Panthers, which were mass-producible, but the resources spent on other designs led to the following statistics. Just before and during the Second World War, Great Britain produced almost 30,000 tanks. Germany produced almost 50,000 tanks. The United States of America and the Soviet Union produced at the very least 90,000 tanks each. No matter how good, well-armed or armored the tank is, it cannot compete with those numbers, especially when the nation does not have air superiority. After the Second World War, the tank design evolved into something we now know today as the main battle tank. Advancements in armament, armor, and engines allowed for the main battle tank to appear, as it has the firepower of a tank destroyer, the protection of a heavy tank, and the mobility of a medium one. And even to this day, each nation has its own tank philosophy. Great Britain focusing on crew survivability, the Americans focusing on versatility, the Russians focusing on firepower and low profile, low detectability. The Swedes are in their own world with their wedge of cheese tank. And that was for the short and probably wrong history of tanks. If you are ever in Dorset, go to the Bovington Tank Museum. It's worth it. Especially when you can catch a tank fest. But before I jump to footage of that, let's have a look at a few oddball tanks in the museum. Any World of Tanks player should be able to recognize this medium tank. It's the tank they start the line until they reach this monstrosity. The question being, how big do you want your main gun, and the answer being yes. Believe it or not, this was a real prototype in the 50s, though if you fired the gun at 90 degrees it had the tendency to roll the tank over. Who knew putting cruiser guns on tanks doesn't work? And speaking of absurd tanks, hot togs, anyone? Yeah, this is the Tog 2. Built by the old gang, a bunch of World War I tank veterans which thought that the Second World War is going to be a repeat of the first one, as in static. German blitzkrieg tactics made sure to say 9 to that. Ah, the Covenanter. A tank so problematic the British refused to send it to war. It failed so that its successor, the Crusader, would succeed. I love the Crusader. Anyway, until next time, enjoy some Tankfest footage. That as a post-editing note, I decided to split it into 2 parts because I don't want to make a 20-minute video. The link for the second part is pasted in the description, and I'll just put it here as well.